The world that we understand, globalization, international trade, air travel, global finance, global energy, all of it is a side effect of a strategic program the Americans put into effect back in the 1940s and early 1950s. After the liberation of Europe at the end of World War II, we found ourselves facing down Stalin's army, and honestly, it scared the crap out of us. And so we had to figure out a way of convincing Europe, which had just finished a series of civil wars among themselves that were the most destructive in history, to line up shoulder to shoulder for common cause and face down the Soviets, not with us, but in front of us, because we knew that we would never be able to get troops there in time if a new war broke out. So we bribed them. We basically paid everybody to be on our side. We used our military to create a global order that allowed any country to go anywhere and purchase any commodity, ship it home, metabolize it into a finished good, and then re-export it largely to our market in order to grow themselves back into being successful countries again. And over time, this was expanded from not just the victorious allies in Europe, but to the Germans and to the Japanese and to the Koreans and the Taiwanese, and eventually to almost the entire world, including the developing world. That is what created the world that we know. What has now changed is that the United States has lost interest. Ever since 1992, at the end of the Soviet period, the strategic rationale for our involvement has steadily dropped, and we have lacked the political leadership on either side of the aisle to come up with a replacement grand strategy. And so we've just been on autopilot for 30 years, and Donald Trump is the president who is kind of ushering in the end. Now, if we had had a President Hillary Clinton, we'd probably be doing the same thing. We'd just be a little bit more organized about it. We'd probably be using the State Department more and Twitter less, but it would get us to the same location. That's kind of piece one. Piece two is demographics. People in their 20s act different from people in their 40s, act different from people in their 60s and their 80s. And what has happened is, as the world has industrialized and urbanized since World War II, in part because of the global order, the global population has changed. It used to be we had a population pyramid with lots of children at the bottom, very few retirees at the top. And what's happened is kind of inverted now. So we've got this huge bulge of people in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Europe that are in their 50s and 60s. They just never had a lot of kids. So the younger part of the population is hollowed out. And when you're in your 50s and your 60s, you don't consume as much, but you're very productive. So this whole export-led economic model that we see in so many places, that's a direct outcome of this. Well, 10 years after you're in your 50s, you're in retirement. And in this decade, pretty much every significant country except for two age into mass retirement, which means that this global economic structure that is based upon the export of goods and the consumption of goods elsewhere, that was going to end anyway this decade. The two countries of significance that don't have this population structure are France and the United States. And that is not enough to maintain a global order, specifically since the Americans don't care anymore. So for economic reasons and for strategic reasons, this was all going to end in the next few years anyway. And what coronavirus has done is speed it up. I'm glad that the book didn't come out any later than it did. It came out the week that the United States was starting to realize that this might be a real thing. But we're looking at all these countries that are export-led. If they were smart, they were starting to explore how they could change their economic and political system to work in a world without America, in a world without trade, in a world without global energy or global finance, and a world without mass consumption. That's a big step. It's a heavy haul. What coronavirus has done is taken their transition time and they've removed it. Most countries will never recover to where they were in February, which means that most countries now have a political and economic system that is doomed to be a history's ash heap. I mean, this really is the end for a lot. Well, demographics is a piece of it. And remember, none of these are deterministic. They all help. And if you don't have any of them, you're kind of screwed. But just because you don't have all of them, doesn't mean you're not going to succeed. So a demographic structure that's sustainable. So if, the bulk of your population is in its 50s now, it's really hard to get past that. So preferably a younger population with at least replacement level population growth and maybe a political system that is relatively friendly towards immigration. That's one. Number two, you need an energy structure that allows you to literally keep the lights on and keep your place running. If you don't have the ability to generate your energy locally, whether it's from something like the shale revolution or a good solar quotient, at least have a neighbor that you're on good terms with that you can bring in energy. Third, you got to be able to feed your people. Or again, like with energy, have a neighbor that can help you out with that. But most importantly, you've got to have good geographic barriers. between you and your neighbors. You've got to make sure that it's very difficult for other countries that might be hostile to reach you in the first place. But on the flip side, you've got to make sure the interior of your country is flat and open enough that you can actually integrate politically. Chechnya is not a successful country. The Russians are right on the border. It's a mountainous place. It's very clannish. Because of the mountains, they fight at each other. Think West Virginia. There aren't very many places in the world that have this kind of setup. Really, there's only 5. The U.S. is far and away the most powerful of all of them. In Europe, it's the French. And we like to make fun of the French in the Anglosphere for being, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, I believe is what the Simpsons called them. We forget that aside from the United Kingdom, the French have won more wars in their history than any other country in the world. It's just because we've got that little Anglo split that we like to poke fun of them anymore. They're a wildly successful country that has been around as a culture for 1,500 years. They're not going anywhere. And they don't border any of the countries that are likely to be security threats to them in the future. So really the future is theirs to lose. In the Middle East, Turkey. Forget Saudi Arabia, forget Iran. Those are 2 countries that are going to be locked into a Faustian death match here in not too distant future. That leaves it to Turkey to inherit the region. In East Asia, it's not China. China is one of the most vulnerable countries in human history. And the only reason it's been successful for the last 70 years, especially the last 40, is because of the American-led order. We broke up the empires, we allowed global trade, and all of a sudden they unified really for the first time. When the Americans leave, that's the end of the Chinese. It's Japan that's going to rule the future. It's Japan that has the world's 2nd largest navy, and it's Japan that really hasn't faced a successful invasion of the home islands ever. Oh yeah, South America, Argentina. Yeah, Argent-freaking-tina. It's everybody talks about Brazil. Brazil's economic success is really a side effect of the order. Global finance has allowed them to overcome a lot of their internal geographic problems, whether it's the tropics or rugged terrain. Or insatiable Chinese demand for their products. But Argentina doesn't need any of that. And in the world that we're going to, rule of law is going to break down. Finance will be hard to come by. Transport will be difficult. International contract law will basically vanish. And, that's what the Argentines call their average Tuesday. They know how to operate in that environment. So it's either Argentina is going to reform itself and move to the median and past it, or Argentina is going to stay exactly as it is, and the median is going to move to them and past them. Either way, in relative terms, Argentina's future looks very bright. Russia proper, forget kind of the near broad area. Russia proper has absolutely no barriers separating it from its neighbors. There are 11 major invasion routes. All of them have been used multiple times in their history. And the primary reason that the Russians are always so damn paranoid is because they're actually aware of their own history. It's not an unwise position. Now, we can all argue over whether or not the world has changed or whether or not a different policy at a different time would have generated a different result. Those are all legitimate conversations to have. But the bottom line is that Russia is one of the most insecure nations in human history. And in the roughly 800-year history of the Russian people, it's just been the story of invasion one after the other after the other. In addition, the climate patterns, not just the fact that it's a cold place, but the erratic nature of the jet stream as it goes over Russia means that they get floods and they get droughts. And there is no such thing as an average agricultural year, and that grinds on you. And simply ruling something like this, where the year in, year out challenges are so big from a security point of view and financial point of view and transport point of view and an agricultural point of view, it's no shock that this is not a land that is particularly fertile for democracy. So what do? You expand until you can build up a series of subject nations that are cannon fodder to fend off invasions until you eventually reach barriers like the Alma-Ata Mountains or the Carpathians that you can kind of hunker behind. And the reason that the Soviet Union was a superpower is because they were able to do that in the closing days of World War II. And they were able to actually form a hard shell in a way that the Russians had never experienced before. That was piece one. Piece two, ironically, was the global order. Because when the Americans broke up all the empires, that included all the empires that had traditionally gone to war with Russia, whether it was Japan or Britain or Germany or whatever else. So the Russians found themselves in the most secure environment they had ever been in their history. And with the exception of the Americans, everyone else was under lockdown strategically. The Americans didn't allow any of their allies to stir up trouble in Russia, because they didn't want to have a broad-scale conflict. That lasted until 1992, which of course is when the economic fallacies of the communist system eventually broke loose and crushed the entire system.